Okay, we're going to finish up the overview handout here. So we're going to do section 5 on phonotactics, as well as the summary at the end of the handout. And yeah, so we've been looking through different features of languages and asking which ones are universal and which ones differ between languages. Anything that differs between languages is something that a child is going to have to learn, is going to have to mentally represent eventually in their mental grammar. And so it's the job of phonology to describe those mental grammars. What are the sets of things that children learn and that they possess implicit or tacit knowledge of in their mental grammars? So we've seen so far that languages have different sounds, they have different inventories of sounds, and they differ in which sounds are contrastive versus phonologically predictable and non-contrastive. So these are all things that children need to learn when they're learning a first language. And they're going to need to be mentally represented somewhere in your mental grammar, where the mental grammar is just the collection of things that you implicitly know or represent about your language. Right? So what other aspects of sound structure differ between languages? Well, there's a lot, but I'm going to mention one more in this handout that's going to play a big role this semester. It's referred to as phonotactics. So far, obviously, every language has some set of allowed sounds, right? Every language has a set of sounds that you can use in that language. But even amongst those sounds that are allowed in a language, not every sound is allowed to follow every other sound, right? It's not just the case that you can take any two sounds of English and put them together and have the beginning of an English word. That's the example here, for instance. And constraints or rules about which kinds of sounds are allowed to follow each other in a language are referred to as phonotactics. It's like how you put together phones. Right? So English, for instance, has a k sound, that's a voiceless velar stop. It has a t sound, which is a voiceless coronal stop. And it has a l sound, which is a lateral liquid approximant sound. Right? So can you just take any of these letters and put them, not letters, sounds. Can you take any of these sounds and put them together and start a word with those two sounds? Well, no, not quite. In English, we can put together k and l to make the beginning of a word. There's lots of words that begin with kl in English, for instance, close or close, or lots and lots of words, right? This is a pretty common word beginning in English. But there are no words in English like ktos. So this star here marks a word that's ungrammatical in English phonology. That's what the asterisk means generally in linguistics, ungrammatical. And so the claim is that it's not just an accident that we don't have any ktos words. This is part of an English speaker's implicit knowledge of what's allowed and not allowed within the English sound system. There are no words that begin with sequences like kta, right? It just doesn't exist in English. And more generally, if I use the word, let's say, tos in a sentence, right? You know that this, how are we going to spell that? Tos. I use that in a sentence, you're going to think, I've never heard that word before. It must be some object that I've never heard of, or it must be some word I just haven't learned yet, right? But you'll readily accept that as a possible English word. Whereas if I use the word ktos in a sentence, you're not going to think, oh, that must be the English name for some object I've never heard of. This is not English at all. Maybe he's talking about something like some Polish food or something like that, because this is not a possible English word. So speakers implicitly know the difference between possible words in their language and impossible ones. This is a possible word that happens not to exist by historical accident. If there'd been something in 13th century northern Germany called a tos, probably tos would be a word in modern English. There just happens not to be. But if there'd been something in 13th century northern Germany called a ktos, it would probably be pronounced differently in modern English, because modern English does not allow sequences like that. So this again is phonotactics. We can write this one as don't have, oh, let me put a word beginning here. That's what we use this pound symbol for. Sorry, that's kind of small. This is the symbol in phonology for the edge of a word. So if you put the edge of a word followed by a k followed by a t, it means words that begin with kt. Right? This is actually fine in the middle of a word, right? We have words like actor in English. That's no problem. You can have that kt sequence in the middle of a word, but just not at the beginning. So we could write this constraint as star word boundary kt. Right? Don't have kt at the beginning of a word. That's a phonotactic constraint in English, or a phonotactic rule of English. Right? So again, is this going to be universal or is it language specific? Well, there are actually many languages out there that allow both kl and kt at the beginning of a word. For instance, Russian, right? The word for who in Russian, WHO, is kto. Right? That's how you ask who in Russian. And kl is also possible in Russian. There's many other languages like this that allow both kl and kt. I've given examples here, Muniche, some varieties of Arabic, probably Moroccan Arabic would be one of those. And there's many other languages that allow both of these. Some other languages like English, which we've just seen, also Spanish, and for the most part French and Italian, although there's maybe some weird little exceptions there, allow the kl one but don't allow the kt one. That's also a pretty common pattern. That's the English pattern that we just looked at, and it's going to be the pattern for most other languages spoken in this class. Well, I was about to say in this classroom, but you know, there's no classroom. And then there's some languages like Mandarin Chinese that don't allow either. You can't begin a word with either one of these sequences in Mandarin. Right? So that's also another possible pattern. So again, these phonotactics, it looks like, are differing from language to language, and speakers possess some implicit knowledge of them. Therefore, speakers must be learning something about the phonotactics of their language as they acquire their mental grammars, and so that's going to be a big part of what phonology is about. Interestingly, you can imagine a language that allows kt, like Russian and Muniche, but doesn't allow kl. I have never heard of such a language, and I'm not holding my breath. I doubt that such a language exists for reasons I'm not going to get into right now, although we'll talk about universals towards the end of the semester. So interestingly, their languages differ with regard to what kinds of phonotactics they have. They probably don't differ without limit. They probably only differ within a prescribed range of different ways. So this is phonotactics. This is going to be a big part of our semester, figuring out how phonotactics work in different languages. And in fact, if you think back in the examples I just gave of predictable phonological distributions, every predictable phonological distribution, in some sense, is also a phonotactic fact about the language. So for instance, in English, where we saw that vowels are nasal before nasal consonants, you could equally well state that as saying that English doesn't allow oral vowels to be followed by nasal consonants. In Spanish, where we saw that mid-front vowels are lax before a trill, you could equally well say that Spanish doesn't allow mid-tense vowels before a trill. That's a phonotactic constraint, right? So phonotactics are sort of the other side of the coin with regard to predictable phonological distributions. Okay, so this was a lot of material. You're not supposed to master all the details from this is just an overview to try to show you where's the class going. What are we going to do in here? So what have we seen? First off, there's phonetics. We're going to spend about a month on that. And that is the nature of speech sounds. That's what phonetics is. How are speech sounds articulated? How do they carry or resonate in the air? That's acoustics. And how are speech sounds heard? That's speech perception. We're going to talk about each of those. And then usually there's a line drawn between phonetics, which is about the nature of speech sounds, and phonology. And that's the study of how those sounds pattern in the grammar. Everything we've been talking about the last couple sections is about patterns of sounds that are and aren't allowed in different languages. That's phonology. Right? Anything that's different in different languages is something that people who speak those languages must have learned at some point. And it's the job of phonology to explain what is it that those people have learned. So I keep referring here to an infant learning their first grammar. That's because the ultimate goal of phonology is to explain what kinds of grammars infants can and can't learn and how they learn the ones they do and don't learn the ones they don't, right? So eventually we're going to want to explain how infants learn grammars, but we're definitely not going to get there this semester. We're going to start with the question, what are the grammars like that they eventually learn? Even if we don't know exactly how they learn them, we can still ask about the final state of the grammar, and that's convenient because we can use adult language to ask those questions, right? So we don't know exactly how English learning infants figure this fact out, but we do know that by the time they're speakers of English, native speakers of English, they definitely don't accept words like this, but do accept words like this. Okay. Some of the things that native speakers seem to know here, and I'm using this language of knowledge, where every time I say that a speaker knows something about their phonology, I don't mean that they could tell you about it if you ask them. I mean that they implicitly know these things. They represent them in their mental grammars, even if they don't have a conscious way to access or verbalize that knowledge. It's something that their behavior reveals, right? That they have represented in their mind. And so amongst the things that speakers implicitly know in this regard are the mental lexicon of their language, the contrastive features of their language, the sound inventories of their language, and the phonotactics of their language. We're going to talk about each of those in this class. That'll actually get us most of the way through the semester, and that's basically what the class is about.